The United States invasion of Panama, codenamed Operation Just Cause, was the invasion of Panama by the United States between mid-December 1989 and late January 1990. It occurred during the administration of U.S. President George H. W. Bush, and 10 years after the Torrijos-Carter treaties were ratified to transfer control of the Panama Canal from the United States to Panama by 1 January 2000. During the invasion, de facto Panamanian leader, general, and dictator Manuel Noriega was deposed, President-elect Guillermo Endara sworn into office, and the Panamanian Defense Force dissolved. Background: the United States long maintained numerous military bases and a substantial garrison throughout the Canal Zone to protect the American-owned Panama Canal, and to maintain American control of this strategically important area. On 7 September 1977, President of the United States Jimmy Carter and the de facto leader of Panama, General Omar Torrijos, signed Torrijos-Carter treaties, which set in motion the process of handing over the Panama Canal to Panamanian control by the year 2000. Although the canal was destined for Panamanian administration, the military bases remained, and one condition of the transfer was that the canal would remain open for American shipping. The U.S. had long-standing relations with General Noriega, who served as a U.S. intelligence asset and paid informant of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1967, including the period when Bush was head of the CIA. Noriega had sided with the U.S. rather than the USSR in Central America, notably in sabotaging the forces of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, and the revolutionaries of the FMLN group in El Salvador. Noriega received upwards of $100,000 per year from the 1960s until the 1980s, when his salary was increased to $200,000 per year. Although he worked with the Drug Enforcement Administration to restrict illegal drug shipments, he was known to simultaneously accept significant financial support from drug dealers, because he facilitated the laundering of drug money, and through Noriega they received protection from investigations due to his special relationship with the CIA. In the mid-1980s, relations between Noriega and the United States began to deteriorate. In 1986, U.S. President Ronald Reagan opened negotiations with General Noriega, requesting that the Panamanian leader step down after he was publicly exposed in the New York Times by Seymour Hersh, and later exposed in the Iran-Contra scandal. Reagan pressured him with several drug-related indictments in U.S. courts. However, since extradition laws between Panama and the U.S. were weak, Noriega deemed this threat not credible and did not submit to Reagan's demands. In 1988, Elliott Abrams and others in the Pentagon began pushing for a U.S. invasion, but Reagan refused, due to Bush's ties to Noriega through his previous positions in the CIA and the Task Force on Drugs, and the potentially negative impact on Bush's presidential campaign. Later negotiations involved dropping the drug trafficking indictments. In March 1988, an attempted coup against the government of Panama was resisted by Noriega's forces. As relations continued to deteriorate, Noriega appeared to shift his Cold War allegiance towards the Soviet bloc, soliciting and receiving military aid from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Libya. American military planners began preparing contingency plans to invade Panama. In May 1989, during the Panamanian national elections, an alliance of parties opposed to the Noriega dictatorship counted results from the country's election precincts before they were sent to the district centers. Their tally showed their candidate, Guillermo Endara, defeating Carlos Duque, candidate of a pro-Noriega coalition, by nearly 3-1. Endara was beaten up by Noriega supporters the next day in his motorcade. Noriega declared the election null and maintained power by force, making him unpopular among Panamanians. Noriega's government insisted that it had won the presidential election and that irregularities had been on the part of U.S.-backed candidates from opposition parties. Bush called on Noriega to honor the will of the Panamanian people. The United States reinforced its Canal Zone garrison, and increased the tempo of training and other activities intended to put pressure on Noriega. In October 1989, Noriega foiled a second coup attempt by members of the Panamanian Defense Forces, led by Major Moises Giraldi. Pressure mounted on Bush as the media labeled him a wimp for failing to aid Panama. In spite of campaign rhetoric that called for a tough stand against drug traffickers, Bush declared that the U.S. would not negotiate with a drug trafficker and denied knowledge of Noriega's involvement with the drug trade prior to his February 1988 indictment. Although Bush had met with Noriega while director of the CIA and had been the chair of the task force on drugs while vice president, on 15 December, the Panamanian General Assembly passed a resolution declaring that the actions of the United States had caused a state of war to exist between Panama and the United States. Next day, 4 U.S. military personnel were stopped at a roadblock around 9 p.m. outside PDF headquarters in the El Chorrillo neighborhood of Panama City. Marine Captain Richard E. Haddad, Navy Lieutenant Michael J. Wilson, Army Captain Barry L. Rainwater, and Marine First Lieutenant Robert Paz had left the Fort Clayton military base and were on their way to have dinner at the Marriott Hotel in downtown Panama City. The U.S. Department of Defense reported that the servicemen had been unarmed, in a private vehicle and that they attempted to flee only after their vehicle was surrounded by an angry crowd of civilians and PDF troops. The PDF asserted later that the Americans were armed and on a reconnaissance mission. The PDF opened fire and Lieutenant Paz was fatally wounded by a round that entered the rear of the vehicle and struck him in the back. Captain Haddad, the driver of the vehicle, was also wounded in the foot. Paz was rushed to Gorgaz Army Hospital but died of his wounds. He received the Purple Heart posthumously. According to U.S. military sources, a U.S. naval officer and his wife witnessed the incident and were detained by Panamanian Defense Force soldiers. While in police custody, they were assaulted by the PDF. The U.S. naval officer spent 2 weeks in hospital recovering from the beating. His wife was not injured but was sexually threatened by PDF soldiers. The next day, President Bush ordered the execution of the Panama invasion plan. The military set H-hour as 0100 on 20 December. United States' justification for the invasion. The official U.S. justification for the invasion was articulated by President George H. W. Bush on the morning of 20 December 1989, a few hours after the start of the operation. Bush listed 4 reasons for the invasion: safeguarding the lives of U.S. citizens in Panama. In his statement, Bush stated that Noriega had declared that a state of war existed between the U.S. and Panama and that he threatened the lives of the approximately 35,000 U.S. citizens living there. There had been numerous clashes between U.S. and Panamanian forces. 1 U.S. Marine had been killed a few days earlier, defending democracy and human rights in Panama, combating drug trafficking. Panama had become a center for drug money laundering and a transit point for drug trafficking to the U.S. and Europe, protecting the integrity of the Torrijos-Carter treaties. Members of Congress and others in the U.S. political establishment claimed that Noriega threatened the neutrality of the Panama Canal and that the U.S. had the right under the treaties to intervene militarily to protect the canal. U.S. military forces were instructed to begin maneuvers and activities within the restrictions of the Torrijos-Carter treaties, such as ignoring PDF roadblocks and conducting short-notice, Category 3, military exercises on security-sensitive targets, with the express goal of provoking PDF soldiers. U.S. SOUTHCOM kept a list of abuses against U.S. servicemen and civilians by the PDF, while the orders to incite PDF soldiers were in place. As for the Panamanian legislature's declaration of a state of war between the U.S. and Panama, Noriega insists that this statement referred to a state of war directed by the U.S. against Panama, in the form of what he claimed were harsh economic sanctions and constant, provocative military maneuvers that were prohibited by the Torrijos-Carter treaties. The U.S. had turned a blind eye to Noriega's involvement in drug trafficking since the 1970s. Noriega was then singled out for direct involvement in these drug trafficking operations due to the widespread public knowledge of his involvement in money laundering, drug activities, political murder, and human rights abuses. Bush's 4 reasons for the invasion provided sufficient justification to establish bipartisan congressional approval and support for the invasion. However, the secrecy before initiation, the speed and success of the invasion itself, and U.S. public support for it did not allow Democrats to object to Bush's decision to use military force. One contemporary study suggests that Bush decided to invade for domestic political reasons, citing scarce strategic reasoning for the U.S. to invade an immediate withdrawal without establishing the structure to enforce the interests that Bush used to justify the invasion. 2 days before the invasion, on the 18th of December, Panama announced that the U.S. was planning an invasion of Panama. Invasion. The U.S. Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines participated in Operation Just Cause. Ground forces consisted of combat elements of the 18th Airborne Corps, the 82nd Airborne Division, the 7th Infantry Division, the 75th Ranger Regiment, a Joint Special Operations Task Force, elements of the 5th Infantry Division, 1st Battalion, 61st U.S. Infantry and 4th Battalion, 6th United States Infantry, 1138th Military Police Company of the Missouri Army National Guard, 988 Military Police Company out of F.D. Benning, GA, 193rd Infantry Brigade, 5th Battalion, 87th Infantry 1st Battalion, 508th Infantry, Battery D, 320th Field Artillery, 59th Engineer Company, Marine Security Forces Battalion Panama, Kilo Company of 3rd Battalion, 6th Marine Regiment, Marine Fleet Anti-Terrorism Security Teams, 2nd Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion, 2nd Marine Logistics Group, 39th Combat Engineer BTN, Charlie Co. Air logistics support was provided by the 22nd Air Force with air assets from the 60th, 62nd, and 63rd Military Airlift Wings. The military incursion into Panama began on the 20th of December 1989, at 1 a.m. local time. The operation involved 27,684 U.S. troops and over 300 aircraft, including C-130 Hercules tactical transports flown by the 317th Tactical Airlift Wing and 314th Tactical Airlift Wing. A C-130 Spectre gunship, OA-37B Dragonfly observation and attack aircraft, C-141 Starlifter and C-5 Galaxy strategic transports. F-117A Nighthawk stealth aircraft flown by the 37th Tactical Fighter Wing, and R-64 Apache attack helicopter. The invasion of Panama was the first combat deployment for the R-64, the HMMWV, and the F-117A. Panamanian radar units were jammed by 2 F-111 as of the 390th ECS, 366th TFW. These aircraft were deployed against the 16,000 members of the PDF. The operation began with an assault of strategic installations, such as the civilian Punta Paitilla Airport in Panama City and a PDF garrison and airfield at Rio Hato, where Noriega also maintained a residence. U.S. Navy SEALs destroyed Noriega's private jet and a Panamanian gunboat. A Panamanian ambush killed 4 SEALs and wounded 9. Other military command centers throughout the country were also attacked. The attack on the central headquarters of the PDF touched off several fires, one of which destroyed most of the adjoining and heavily populated El Chorrillo neighborhood in downtown Panama City. During the firefight at the commandancia, the PDF downed 2 special operations helicopters and forced one MH-6 Little Bird to crash land in the Panama Canal. Fort Amador was secured by elements of the 1st Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and 59th Engineer Company in a nighttime air assault which secured the fort in the early hours of the 20th of December. Fort Amador was a key position because of its relationship to the large oil farms adjacent to the canal, the Bridge of the Americas over the canal, and the Pacific entrance to the Panama Canal. Key command and control elements of the PDF were stationed there. C Company 1st Battalion 508th PIR was assigned the task of securing La Comandancia. Furthermore, Fort Amador had a large U.S. housing district that needed to be secure to prevent the PDF from taking U.S. citizens as hostages. This position also protected the left flank of the attack on the Comandancia and the securing of the El Chorrillos neighborhood, guarded by dignity battalions, Noriega supporters that the U.S. forces sometimes refer to as dingbats. A few hours after the invasion began, Guillermo Endara was sworn in at Fort Clayton. According to the Los Angeles Times, Endara was the presumed winner in the presidential election which had been scheduled earlier that year. A platoon from the 1138th Military Police Company, Missouri Army National Guard, which was on a routine 2-week rotation to Panama, was called upon to set up a detainee camp on Empire Range to handle the massive civilian and military detainees. This unit was the first National Guard unit called into active service since the Vietnam War. Noriega's capture Operation Nifty Package was an operation launched by Navy SEALs to prevent Noriega's escape. They sank Noriega's boat and destroyed his jet, at a cost of 4 killed and 9 wounded. Military operations continued for several weeks, mainly against military units of the Panamanian Army. Noriega remained at large for several days, but realizing he had few options in the face of a massive manhunt and a $1 million reward for his capture, he obtained refuge in the Vatican diplomatic mission in Panama City. The U.S. military's psychological pressure on him and diplomatic pressure on the Vatican mission, however, was relentless, as was the playing of loud rock and roll music day and night in a densely populated area. The report of the Office of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff maintains that the music was used principally to prevent parabolic microphones from being used to eavesdrop on negotiations, and not as a psychological weapon based around Noriega's supposed loathing of rock music. Noriega finally surrendered to the U.S. military on 3 January 1990. He was immediately put on an MC-130E combat Talon I aircraft and flown to the U.S. Casualties. According to official Pentagon figures, 516 Panamanians were killed during the invasion. However, an internal U.S. Army memo estimated the number at 1,000. The UN estimated 500 deaths, whereas America's Watch found that around 300 civilians died. President Guillermo Endara said that less than 600 Panamanians died during the entire invasion. 23 U.S. service members were killed and 325 were wounded. But in June 1990, the U.S. military announced that of the casualties, 2 dead and 19 wounded were victims of friendly fire. The U.S. Southern Command, then based on Corey Heights in Panama, estimated the number of Panamanian military dead at 205, lower than its original estimate of 314. Civilian fatalities included an American schoolteacher working in Panama, and a Spanish freelance press photographer on assignment for El País. Juan Antonio Rodriguez Moreno. Rodriguez was killed outside of the Marriott Hotel in Panama City early on December 21. In June 1990, his family filed a claim for wrongful death against the United States government. When the Rodriguez claim was rejected by the U.S. government, in 1992, the Spanish government sent a note verbal extending diplomatic protection to Rodriguez and demanding compensation on behalf of his family. However, the U.S. government again rejected the claim, disputing both its liability for war zone deaths in general and whether Rodriguez had been killed by U.S. rather than Panamanian gunfire. Human Rights Watch's 1991 report on Panama in the post-invasion aftermath stated that even with some uncertainties about the scale of civilian casualties, the figures are still troublesome, because Panama's civilian deaths reveal that the surgical operation by American forces inflicted a toll in civilian lives that was at least 4.5 times higher than military casualties in the enemy, and 12 or 13 times higher than the casualties suffered by U.S. troops by themselves. These ratios suggest that the rule of proportionality and the duty to minimize harm to civilians, where doing so would not compromise a legitimate military objective, were not faithfully observed by the invading U.S. forces. For us, the controversy over the number of civilian casualties should not obscure the important debate on the manner in which those people died. The Commission for the Defense of Human Rights in Central America estimated 2,500–3,000 deaths, and the Commission for the Defense of Human Rights in Panama estimated 3,500 deaths. Origin of the name: Operation Just Cause. Operation plans directed against Panama evolved from plans designed to defend the Panama Canal. They became more aggressive as the situation between the two nations deteriorated. The prayer book series of plans included rehearsals for a possible clash and missions to secure U.S. sites. Eventually, these plans became Operation Blue Spoon, which was then, in order to sustain the perceived legitimacy of the invasion throughout the operation, renamed by the Pentagon to Operation Just Cause. General Colin Powell said that he liked the name because even our severest critics would have to utter "just cause" while denouncing us. The post-invasion civil-military operation designed to stabilize the situation, support the U.S.-installed government, and restore basic services was originally planned as Operation Blind Logic, but was renamed Operation Promote Liberty by the Pentagon on the eve of the invasion. The Panamanian name for the operation is La Invasion. The original operation, in which U.S. troops were deployed to Panama early 1989, was called Operation Nimrod Dancer.